In January of 1944, one of America's most expensive private residences became the death chamber of a broke Gilded Age heir. Eagle's Nest, where millions had been spent creating a fortress on Long Island's North Shore, where imported materials covered every surface, where the Vanderbilt name should have guaranteed eternal prestige, would outlive its builder by mere weeks. The mansion was complete. The fortune was gone. The family legacy was fragmenting. William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr., grandson of the richest man in America, was dying without having achieved the one thing all his wealth was meant to purchase: mattering. Then the estate lawyers began documenting what remained. Second and third generation heirs built monuments to insecurity across the Gilded Age. They constructed palaces, endowed museums, financed expeditions, all attempting to prove they deserved names they had merely inherited. Most failed. Their buildings endured. Their reputations did not. William K. Vanderbilt Jr. followed this pattern to its logical conclusion. Third generation, impossible position. He built Eagle's Nest as desperate proof of worthiness. The mansion succeeded architecturally. Willie failed personally. Everything he built outlasted everything he was. This is the story of Eagle's Nest and the desperate heir who built it. If you appreciate deep dives into forgotten Gilded Age tragedies, consider subscribing. These stories take extensive research, and your support makes them possible. What began as the Commodore's dynasty would fracture in Willie's hands, despite enormous sums spent trying to hold it together. The tragedy was not in the spending, but in the fundamental miscalculation about what buildings could prove. Chapter 1. The Weight of a Name. William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr. was born on October 26, 1878, in the Vanderbilt Mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, where his entire family lived under the weight of a fortune so large that managing it required dozens of advisors, lawyers, and investment specialists. His grandfather, William Henry Vanderbilt, controlled approximately $200 million inherited from the Commodore. His father, William Kissam Vanderbilt Sr., held a substantial portion in trust. The Vanderbilts represented wealth itself in American consciousness. Then Willie was born as the third generation. The fortune that would both sustain and destroy him had been built by his great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, universally known as the Commodore. Born in 1794 to a Staten Island farming family, Cornelius had accumulated $100 million through steamships and railroads by the time of his death in 1877, 1 year before Willie's birth. The Commodore had been ruthless in business, crushing competitors through rate wars and strategic acquisitions. He had no patience for weakness and little affection for most of his children. When the Commodore died, he left 90% of his fortune to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, Willie's grandfather. The other children received comparative pittances, typically around $250,000 each. The decision centralized the dynasty in a single line. William Henry inherited not just wealth, but the burden of proving he deserved it. William Henry proved more than capable. Between 1877 and his death in 1885, he doubled the Vanderbilt fortune through railroad consolidation and shrewd management of the New York Central Railroad. By the time he died, the fortune totaled approximately $200 million, making him likely the richest man in America and possibly the world. But the effort destroyed his health. He worked relentlessly, managing investments, overseeing railroad operations, defending against competitors. The fortune grew. William Henry deteriorated. Willie was 7 years old when his grandfather died in 1885. He would have no direct memory of the man whose fortune defined his life. What Willie inherited was not just money, but expectation. The Vanderbilt name meant something. It meant railroads and wealth and power. It meant accomplishment. Willie would spend his life trying to justify carrying it. William Henry had learned from his father's mistake. Rather than concentrate the fortune in a single heir, he distributed it more evenly among his children, though the largest shares still went to his sons. Willie's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt Sr., received approximately $65 million in trust. The amount was vast. The structure was protective. Willie's father could access income from the trust but could not liquidate the principal. The arrangement was designed to preserve family wealth across generations. William K. Vanderbilt Sr. was competent but not exceptional. He served as director of various railroad companies, managed investments with professional assistants, and built mansions as visible demonstrations of status. He possessed the Vanderbilt fortune without the Vanderbilt genius that had created it. His talent lay in not losing what he had inherited rather than in creating anything new. In 1875, William K. Sr. married Alva Erskine Smith, a Southern belle whose family had lost their fortune during the Civil War. Alva was beautiful, ambitious, and ruthlessly focused on social position. She had married for money and made no pretense otherwise. The marriage was a transaction. William K. Sr. gained a socially adept wife who would manage their household and social calendar. Alva gained access to Vanderbilt wealth and the opportunity to force New York society to acknowledge her. Willie was born into this marriage in 1878. His childhood was spent in Vanderbilt mansions, surrounded by servants, educated by private tutors, insulated from the realities that shaped most American lives. He grew up understanding that he was a Vanderbilt, that the name meant something, that people expected certain things from him. What those expectations were remained unclear. The first generation had built, the second generation had managed. What was the third generation supposed to do? His mother built Marble House in Newport. His father paid for it without complaint. Willie watched his parents' marriage function as social performance rather than emotional partnership. He learned that Vanderbilts proved themselves through construction, through visible demonstrations of wealth and taste. Buildings mattered, appearances mattered. Actually achieving anything beyond spending well remained optional. The pressure intensified when Willie's younger brother Harold was born in 1884. Harold, 6 years younger than Willie, would prove more accomplished in every domain Willie attempted. Harold possessed natural talents that Willie lacked. He was a better athlete, a better sailor, a more capable businessman. Harold would win the America's Cup 3 times. He would invent modern contract bridge. He would manage family investments successfully. Willie would watch his younger brother succeed where he himself failed, the comparison becoming more painful with each year. Willie's formal education followed the pattern expected of Vanderbilt heirs. Private tutors initially, then prep school, then entry into Columbia University. He did not distinguish himself academically. His grades were adequate. His engagement was minimal. He attended because Vanderbilts attended university, not because he had particular scholarly interests or career ambitions. What would a Vanderbilt heir do with a career anyway? The fortune provided everything. Work was unnecessary. Achievement was optional. By the time Willie reached his 20s, the pattern was established. He possessed the Vanderbilt name, the Vanderbilt fortune, and the Vanderbilt social position. He lacked the Vanderbilt abilities that had justified all three. His great-grandfather had built an empire through ruthless business acumen. His grandfather had doubled that empire through skilled management. His father maintained the fortune adequately. Willie had accomplished nothing. The family's social position was secure. By the 1890s, Alva had forced acceptance through sheer determination and strategic mansion building. The Vanderbilts were acknowledged as American aristocracy, if such a thing existed. But acknowledgement of the family name did not equal acknowledgement of individual worth. Willie carried a name that demanded he matter personally, not just dynastically. The pressure was constant. The path forward was unclear. William K. Sr. divorced Alva in 1895 when Willie was 17. The divorce was scandalous. Alva's infidelity was alleged in court documents. The settlement was generous. She kept Marble House and substantial financial support. She remarried quickly to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a wealthy sportsman who had been her lover during the marriage. The scandal was enormous. New York society was horrified and fascinated. Willie watched his parents' marriage end and observed that his mother's social position survived intact. Marble House, the building she had constructed to force social acceptance, protected her despite personal failure. The mansion she had built mattered more than the marriage she had destroyed. The lesson was clear, if unconscious. Buildings were permanent in ways relationships were not. Willie was born into wealth that demanded achievement, a family that expected prominence, and a dynasty that required he matter. He possessed the Vanderbilt fortune, but not the Vanderbilt abilities. The pressure to prove himself worthy would consume his life. Chapter 2. Marble House's shadow. In 1892, Alva Vanderbilt completed construction of Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. The house was not a home, but a declaration, a weapon designed to force New York society to acknowledge Vanderbilt legitimacy. The building succeeded completely. The marriage it was built to glorify collapsed 3 years later. Willie was 14 when construction began, 17 when his parents divorced, old enough to understand that his mother had built permanent proof of significance and that the proof worked even after the marriage failed. Alva had engaged Richard Morris Hunt as architect in 1888. Hunt had already designed the breakers for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Willie's cousin. That mansion had established Hunt as the architect of choice for Vanderbilt ambitions. Alva wanted Hunt to surpass everything he had built previously. She wanted a house that would force Mrs. Caroline Astor, the acknowledged queen of New York society, to visit Newport and acknowledge Alva Vanderbilt as an equal. Hunt proposed a design based on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The house would be built of marble, lots of marble, more marble than any private residence in America. The scale would be enormous. The cost would be staggering. Alva approved without hesitation. William K. Sr. would pay. He always paid. That was his function in the marriage. Construction began in 1888 and consumed 4 years. The process was obsessive. Hunt sourced 500,000 cubic feet of marble from quarries in Italy and Africa. Different marbles for different purposes. White marble for walls, colored marble for floors, rare marble for decorative elements. The marble arrived in Newport by ship, was hauled to the construction site by teams of horses, and was installed by Italian craftsmen brought to America specifically for this project. The interior was covered in gold leaf. Hunt designed rooms in different historical styles: a Gothic-style dining room, a Rococo-style ballroom, a Renaissance-style library. Each room was a demonstration of Alva's cultural sophistication and William K. Sr.'s willingness to spend whatever was required. The furnishings were custom-made in France. The paintings were purchased from European dealers. Nothing was too expensive, nothing too elaborate, nothing sufficient until it exceeded anything else in Newport. Construction consumed 4 years and $11 million, including furnishings. The cost was staggering even by Vanderbilt standards. $11 million. Dollars in 1892 represented wealth beyond most Americans' comprehension. William K. Sr. paid it without complaint. His function was writing checks. Alva's function was spending them in ways that forced social acknowledgement. The arrangement worked. Marble House opened in the summer of 1892. Newport society attended the inaugural ball in enormous numbers. More importantly, Mrs. Caroline Astor attended. Her presence was the validation Alva had purchased. The Vanderbilts, who had been considered new money and therefore socially inferior, were now acknowledged as equals by the woman who determined such things. The building had accomplished its purpose. Society had bowed. The ball of 1883, held at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, had been Alva's first major social victory. She had planned the event meticulously and then withheld an invitation to Caroline Astor's daughter, until Mrs. Astor personally called on Alva to request one. The call was social surrender. The Astors acknowledged the Vanderbilts. But that victory had been tactical. Marble House was strategic. The building was permanent proof that money could purchase social position if spent with sufficient determination and taste. Willie absorbed what his mother had demonstrated. Buildings were permanent in ways relationships were not. Mansions proved worth when personal achievement proved insufficient. Marble House had succeeded. Society had acknowledged Alva. The method was clear. If one wanted to matter, one built something that could not be ignored. In 1895, William K. Sr. demanded divorce. The grounds were adultery. Alva's relationship with Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont had become impossible to ignore. The divorce proceedings were nasty. The settlement negotiations were complex. The final agreement allowed Alva to keep Marble House. She retained the building that had been her greatest achievement. William K. Sr. kept most other assets, but lost the Newport mansion. The scandal was enormous. Divorce among the ultra-wealthy was uncommon. Divorce where adultery was publicly alleged was almost unprecedented. New York society expected Alva's social position to collapse. It did not. Marble House protected her. The building she had constructed to force acceptance continued to serve that function, even after the marriage that had financed it ended. She remained socially acceptable because she owned Marble House, and Marble House was undeniably significant. Willie was 17 when his parents' marriage ended publicly and humiliatingly. He watched his mother survive social scandal because she possessed a building everyone acknowledged as important. He watched his father, who had paid for everything, lose social position because he lost the building. The lesson reinforced itself. Buildings mattered more than the people who built them. Visible monuments to wealth and taste could create significance that personal qualities could not. Alva remarried Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in 1896. She moved into his mansion briefly, then convinced him to move into Marble House with her. The building was hers. It defined her. It proved she mattered regardless of which husband was funding her lifestyle. The mansion had succeeded in ways the marriages had not. Alva had solved a problem that Willie would spend his life confronting. How does one prove significance when born significant? She had built. The building had worked. Willie would remember. Chapter 3. Eagle's Nest Conceived. In 1910, William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. purchased 43 acres of waterfront property in Centerport, Long Island, for approximately $250,000. The land offered views of Northport Bay and sufficient isolation from established Newport and Long Island estates where other Vanderbilts had built. Willie was 32 years old, divorced from Virginia Fair after 11 years of marriage that had produced one daughter. He had accomplished nothing of significance. The land would change that. Willie's first marriage had been typical of Gilded Age arrangements. Virginia Fair was the daughter of James Graham Fair, a silver mining millionaire who had made his fortune in Nevada's Comstock Lode. The marriage in 1899 joined two substantial fortunes without creating much personal affection. Virginia and Willie moved in the same social circles, shared similar backgrounds, and found each other acceptable marriage partners. Love was not discussed. Compatibility was assumed based on wealth and social position. The marriage produced one child, Muriel, born in 1900. Willie was a distant father, uncomfortable with children, uncertain what role he was supposed to play. His own childhood had been spent largely in the care of servants and tutors. He replicated that arrangement for his daughter. Muriel was raised by nannies, educated by governesses, and saw her parents primarily at formal meals and on scheduled occasions. By 1905, the marriage had failed in all but legal terms. Willie and Virginia maintained separate residences, pursued separate interests, and rarely appeared together except when social obligations demanded it. The divorce in 1910 was amicable in the sense that both parties wanted it, and neither contested the settlement. Virginia received substantial financial support. Willie retained custody rights he rarely exercised. Muriel, at age 10, understood that her parents' marriage had been a business arrangement that had reached its natural conclusion. The divorce freed Willie to pursue his own vision without the pretense of maintaining a family household. He was 32 years old. He had lived his entire adult life as a Vanderbilt heir without accomplishing anything that justified the name. His attempts at achievement had been modest and unsuccessful. He had dabbled in business ventures that went nowhere. He had collected art without developing genuine expertise. He had traveled extensively without purpose. He possessed everything except the one thing that mattered, a reason to be remembered beyond his last name. The land purchase in Centerport represented a decision. Willie would build something that would prove he deserved the Vanderbilt name. The location was deliberate. Other Vanderbilts had built at Idle Hour, an estate complex in Long Island where several family members maintained properties. Willie's cousin William Vanderbilt had built a substantial mansion there. The Newport estates, including his mother's Marble House and cousin Cornelius's The Breakers, represented the family's most visible presence. Willie wanted distance from these concentrations of Vanderbilt building. He would create something separate, something distinctly his. Centerport was more remote than fashionable Long Island locations. The North Shore was developing, but slowly. The area lacked the social infrastructure of Newport or the convenience of estates closer to New York City. Willie chose it precisely because it was separate. His monument would stand alone, not in comparison to other Vanderbilt achievements. The 43 acres provided complete privacy. The property fronted on Northport Bay, offering water access for Willie's yachts. The land rose from the shoreline, providing elevation for a building site with views across the Sound. The location was approximately 50 miles from New York City, close enough for weekend visits but far enough to feel removed from urban pressures. Willie established no budget for what he planned to build. The approach was simple: whatever it costs. His inheritance provided substantial annual income. The Vanderbilt fortune had supported 3 generations without diminishing noticeably. He would build what he envisioned, and money would not limit that vision. The trust structure meant he could not spend down the principal, even if he wanted to. He could only spend the income the trusts generated. That income seemed infinite. For the architecture, Willie made a decision that revealed both his ambition and his insecurity. He would not build in American styles. His father had built in French Renaissance style. His cousins had built variations on European palaces. Willie would build something different, something distinctive, something that could not be compared directly to other Vanderbilt achievements. He chose Spanish Revival. The style was unusual for the Northeast. Spanish Revival architecture had associations with California and the Southwest, not Long Island. That was precisely the appeal. Willie would build a Spanish fortress on the Long Island Sound, something no one else had done, something that would be unique and therefore memorable. He hired Hunt and Hunt, the architectural firm operated by the sons of Richard Morris Hunt. The irony was deliberate. His mother had used Richard Morris Hunt to design Marble House. Willie would use Hunt's sons to design Eagle's Nest. The connection to his mother's achievement was both acknowledgement and competition. She had proven that buildings could force recognition. He would prove it again, on his own terms, in his own style. The initial sketches showed a fortress-like structure, massive and imposing. Willie wanted something that looked permanent, something that suggested it had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. The architects proposed Spanish castles as references. Willie approved. He wanted Moorish influences, courtyards, thick walls, defensive features that suggested strength and endurance. The building would be a statement of permanence in an age when everything seemed temporary. The plans developed through 1910 with Willie's obsessive involvement. He reviewed every drawing, questioned every decision, demanded explanations for choices that seemed ordinary or conventional. The house would have approximately 24 rooms, far more than one man needed, but appropriate for a Vanderbilt estate. The scale needed to be substantial. Small buildings did not matter. Only monuments to excess generated the attention that proved significance. Willie had found his purpose. He would build Eagle's Nest, a Spanish Revival mansion overlooking Long Island Sound. The architects began drawing. The contractors began estimating. The fortune began flowing toward Long Island. The calculations had begun. The accounting would come later. Chapter 4. Construction as monument. Construction of Eagle's Nest began in spring of 1910 with foundation work designed to support a structure built for centuries, not generations. Willie insisted on importing tiles from Seville, ironwork from Madrid, and stone from Spanish quarries. He hired craftsmen who specialized in Moorish-influenced Spanish architecture and paid premiums for their expertise. The cost was irrelevant. The house needed to surpass every other Vanderbilt estate. By 1912, expenses had exceeded $5 million with years of work remaining. The foundation alone consumed $400,000 and 6 months of intensive labor. Willie had instructed the architects that the building must be constructed to last indefinitely. The foundation was reinforced concrete poured to depths that seemed excessive for a residential structure. But Willie was not building a house. He was building a monument. The foundation needed to support not just the physical weight of the structure, but the historical weight of establishing Willie Vanderbilt's legacy. The tiles were custom-made in Seville by craftsmen who still practiced techniques developed during the Moorish occupation of Spain. Willie sent detailed specifications about colors, patterns, and dimensions. The tiles were designed to create authentic geometric patterns throughout the interior and exterior of Eagle's Nest. Traditional Moorish designs featured complex mathematical relationships between shapes. The tiles would demonstrate cultural sophistication and commitment to authenticity. Shipping tiles across the Atlantic resulted in substantial breakage. Wooden crates were packed carefully, but ocean transport was rough. Approximately 30% of the first shipment arrived broken. Willie ordered replacements without hesitation. Then he ordered extras beyond what the plans required, anticipating future damage and ensuring that repairs could be made with original materials. The cost multiplied. Willie's only concern was perfection. The ironwork came from Madrid, where workshops still employed techniques refined over centuries. Gates, railings, balcony enclosures, and decorative elements were designed specifically for Eagle's Nest. Each piece was hand-forged by craftsmen who learned their trade through apprenticeship systems dating back generations. The work could not be rushed. Traditional iron forging required time, skill, and attention to detail that modern manufacturing could not replicate. Once completed in Madrid, the ironwork was disassembled, packed, and shipped to New York. Spanish artisans arrived in Centerport to supervise installation. They required housing, interpreters, and premium wages that reflected their specialized expertise. Some remained on Long Island for more than a year, working alongside American construction crews who had never seen such elaborate hand-forged details. The expense was enormous. The results were authentic. The stone came from quarries in Spain that had supplied castles for centuries. Willie wanted stone with history, stone that had been used in buildings that had endured. The geology was less important than the pedigree, Spanish stone for a Spanish revival mansion. Authenticity mattered more than cost or convenience. By 1912, construction had consumed $5 million and showed no signs of nearing completion. The foundation was finished, the stone walls were rising, the roof structure was being installed. But the interior work had barely begun. The tile installation would take more than a year. The ironwork installation would take longer. The plastering, painting, and finishing work remained entirely in the future. Willie visited the construction site obsessively. He arrived weekly, sometimes more often, inspecting progress and questioning any decision that seemed to compromise his vision. Contractors learned to expect his visits and to prepare explanations for choices they had made. Willie had no technical expertise in construction, but he had absolute certainty about what he wanted. The building needed to be perfect. Perfect meant authentic. Authentic meant expensive. The scale of the project had exceeded anything the local contractors had experienced. Centerport was not Newport. The building trades on Long Island were accustomed to substantial houses for wealthy families, but nothing approaching Eagle's Nest's ambition. Specialized craftsmen had to be brought from New York City or imported from Europe. Materials that would normally be sourced locally had to be ordered from Spain and shipped across the ocean. Every aspect of construction was more complicated and more expensive than comparable projects. By 1914, expenditures had reached $8 million. Willie pushed for completion. Multiple contractor teams worked simultaneously on different aspects of the building. The tile installation proceeded room by room. The ironwork installation required careful fitting of pieces made thousands of miles away. Plasterwork followed Spanish techniques that American workers had to learn on site. Original estimates, such as they were, had been abandoned. The project would cost whatever it cost. Willie's only deadline was his own impatience to see the building finished. The final cost, when Eagle's Nest stood complete in 1916, totaled approximately $11 million. Willie had matched his mother's marble house expenditure exactly, though the parallel was never explicitly stated. He had built his monument. The Spanish Revival fortress overlooking Long Island Sound was finished. The materials were authentic. The craftsmanship was expert. The construction was designed for permanence. The structure would endure for centuries. Now it needed to accomplish what it was built to accomplish. Chapter 5. The Technical Achievement. Eagle's Nest achieved what Willie demanded architecturally. The Spanish Revival design was executed with expertise rare in American construction of the era. The tiles created authentic patterns throughout. The ironwork replicated centuries-old techniques. The stone walls stood fortress thick. The mansion was, objectively, a significant achievement in residential architecture. It was also almost completely unknown outside Long Island's North Shore. The tile work represented genuine craftsmanship. The geometric patterns installed throughout the mansion were mathematically precise, following Moorish principles of design that dated back centuries. The colors were traditional: deep blues, rich yellows, earth-toned reds, all created using mineral pigments that would not fade. Each tile was slightly irregular, handmade rather than machine-produced, creating surfaces that had visual warmth modern manufacturing could not replicate. The interior spaces featured different tile patterns in each major room. The entrance hall displayed one geometric design. The main reception room featured another. Bathrooms, kitchens, and service areas each received appropriate tile work. The variety demonstrated both Willie's commitment to authenticity and his willingness to pay for custom work throughout the mansion, rather than repeating patterns to reduce costs. The ironwork was equally impressive technically. Hand-forged gates at the main entrance weighed hundreds of pounds each but moved smoothly on hinges designed and installed by craftsmen who understood how iron behaved under Long Island's climate conditions. Balcony railings featured scrollwork and decorative elements that required hundreds of hours of individual attention. Window grills protected openings while allowing light and air circulation. Every piece was functional art, designed to last indefinitely with minimal maintenance. The stone construction was fortress quality. Walls were thick enough to provide genuine defensive capability if fortifications were required. The thickness was partly aesthetic. Willie wanted the building to look like a Spanish castle, but also structural. The walls would support multiple stories and heavy tile roofing without stress. The construction was overbuilt by residential standards, designed as if the building might need to withstand siege. It would not, but it would stand. The Spanish Revival style was executed authentically in ways few American buildings attempted. Willie had not simply borrowed visual elements from Spanish architecture. He had imported the materials, the craftsmen, and the techniques. The result was a building that could have stood in Andalusia without seeming out of place. Transported to Long Island, it was remarkable. But remarkable architecture did not equal cultural significance. Eagle's Nest was genuinely impressive to anyone who understood Spanish Revival design. The problem was that almost no one outside architectural specialists understood or cared about Spanish Revival design in 1916. The style had limited following in the northeastern United States. Most wealthy Americans building country estates chose French, English, or Italian Renaissance styles. Spanish Revival was exotic, unusual, and largely unappreciated. The mansion received minimal attention from architectural publications. A few professional journals noted its completion with brief descriptions. The general public remained unaware of its existence. Newport mansions like the Breakers received extensive press coverage because Newport was the center of Gilded Age social life. Eagle's Nest, built in relative isolation on Long Island's North Shore, attracted no comparable interest. Willie had created something architecturally significant that failed to generate the recognition he sought. The building proved nothing about Willie himself except that he could hire excellent architects and pay for expensive materials. Quality of construction did not equal significance of person. The disconnect between architectural achievement and personal validation was complete. The mansion succeeded as architecture. Willie failed as its creator. The building proved nothing about the builder except that wealth without vision produces monuments without cultural resonance. Chapter 6. The Compensation Era. William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. established the Vanderbilt Cup automobile races in 1904, 6 years before Eagle's Nest construction began. The races were his first attempt to build a reputation independent of inherited fortune. He was 26 years old, recently married, already searching for achievement that would demonstrate personal merit. The Cup races would continue until 1916, attracting the world's greatest drivers and automotive manufacturers. They would be remembered. Willie's role in creating them would be largely forgotten. This pattern would define every subsequent attempt to prove significance. The idea for automobile racing emerged from Willie's genuine enthusiasm for the new technology. The automobile in 1904 was still experimental, unreliable, expensive, and thrilling. Wealthy enthusiasts bought European cars and raced them informally on public roads. Willie owned several automobiles and drove them with more enthusiasm than skill. He recognized that America lacked organized racing on the European model. He decided to create it. The first Vanderbilt Cup race was held on October 8, 1904, on Long Island roads. Willie put up a trophy and $10,000 in prize money. He invited European manufacturers and drivers to compete against American entries. The course was approximately 30 miles of public roads temporarily closed to other traffic. The race was dangerous, poorly organized, and wildly popular. George Heath, driving a Panhard, won the first Vanderbilt Cup, completing 10 laps in 5 hours, 26 minutes. Approximately 25,000 spectators watched from various points along the course. The event was chaotic. Spectators stood dangerously close to racing cars traveling at unprecedented speeds. Dust clouds made visibility terrible. Mechanical failures eliminated most entries, but the race succeeded in capturing public imagination. Automobiles represented modernity, speed, and technological progress. The Vanderbilt Cup became associated with all three. Willie organized races annually through 1910, each attracting larger crowds and more prestigious entries. The 1906 race drew an estimated 250,000 spectators, overwhelming Long Island's infrastructure. Traffic jams lasted hours. Spectators were injured when cars left the course. The danger and chaos were part of the appeal. This was unregulated competition, speed without safety standards, modernity without restraints. European manufacturers took the races seriously. Mercedes, Fiat, Renault, and Panhard entered factory teams with professional drivers. The competition was genuine. Winning the Vanderbilt Cup meant something to automotive companies trying to establish their technical superiority. The races influenced car design, promoting innovations in engines, tires, and suspension systems. Willie competed in some early races. His results were unremarkable. He finished mid-pack when he competed, demonstrated competence but not exceptional skill. By 1908, he had stopped racing personally, focusing instead on organization and financing. He was not a great driver. He was a great financier of driving. The distinction mattered. The Vanderbilt Cup races cost Willie hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. He paid for trophies, prize money, course preparation, and promotional expenses. The races generated no profit. They were pure expenditure in service of creating something that bore his name. The races succeeded. They established American automobile racing as legitimate sport. They attracted international attention. They influenced automotive development. They would be remembered in motorsport history. Willie would not be. The races were called the Vanderbilt Cup, not Willie's races. The name was institutional, not personal. Motorsport historians would later acknowledge the Cup's importance without dwelling on the individual who created and financed it. Willie had built something significant that existed independently of him. The achievement was real. The personal credit was minimal. The pattern established itself. Willie could create things by spending money. The things he created could matter, but they mattered without making Willie matter. The expenditure proved his wealth. It did not prove his worth. Racing ended in 1916. The reasons were multiple. World War I made European participation impossible. Safety concerns had become overwhelming. Long Island communities were increasingly hostile to the disruption, and Willie had lost interest as the races failed to generate the personal recognition he sought. The final race was held on October 14, 1916, won by Dario, Resta driving a Peugeot. The event drew 300,000 spectators. It was never held again. Yachting consumed even more of Willie's time and money than racing. He owned multiple yachts over the decades, each more expensive than the last. The vessels were not merely transportation or recreation. They were floating monuments to Vanderbilt wealth, requiring crews of dozens and costing hundreds of thousands annually to maintain and operate. His most significant yacht was Ara, a 263-foot steam yacht launched in 1909. The vessel was designed for extended ocean voyages, capable of crossing the Pacific without refueling. Willie used Ara for expeditions to the South Pacific, ostensibly for scientific collecting, but actually for escaping the pressures of being a Vanderbilt who had accomplished nothing of note. Between 1926 and 1928, Willie conducted several Pacific expeditions aboard Ara. The stated purpose was collecting marine specimens for scientific study. Willie hired professional ichthyologists and marine biologists to accompany the voyages and conduct the actual collecting work. He provided financing and his name. The scientists provided expertise and effort. The expeditions collected thousands of fish specimens, shells, and other marine organisms. Some were previously unknown to science. Willie donated specimens to museums and published scientific papers describing new species. His name appeared on the publications. The actual work was done by professional scientists whom Willie employed. He was patron and collector, not scientist. The distinction was clear to everyone except possibly Willie himself. The scientific community was respectful, but not particularly impressed. Wealthy patrons financing collecting expeditions were common. The specimens Willie's employees collected were valuable, but the value came from the specimens, not from Willie. Several fish species were named after him in recognition of his financing rather than his scientific contribution. The distinction was subtle but real. Willie commissioned a second yacht named Alva in the 1930s. The vessel was smaller than Ara, designed for coastal cruising rather than ocean crossing. Willie named it after his mother, who had died in 1933. She never saw the yacht. The gesture was complicated. Willie had spent his life trying to match his mother's achievement of building Marble House. He named a yacht after her, decades after their relationship had been defined by her pressure on him to achieve something worthy of the Vanderbilt name. The yacht proved nothing except that Willie still thought about his mother's expectations. Yachting was typical Vanderbilt pursuit. Harold was a superior sailor, winning the America's Cup 3 times through exceptional skill and strategic brilliance. Willie's yachting was an expensive hobby without competitive success. He owned beautiful vessels, sailed to interesting places, and accomplished nothing that distinguished him from dozens of other wealthy yachtsmen. In 1922, Willie began construction of a museum building at Eagle's Nest to house his marine collections. The Hall of Fishes was designed in Spanish Revival architecture matching the mansion. The building would display specimens collected during Pacific expeditions and would be open to the public, though with limited hours and minimal publicity. The museum represented Willie's attempt to contribute to science and education. The specimens were genuinely significant. Professional biologists studied them. Papers were published describing species Willie's employees had collected. But the museum attracted minimal visitors. Its location on Long Island's North Shore was too remote for casual tourists. Scientists who wanted to study the collections could access them, but the general public remained largely unaware the museum existed. Willie married for the second time in 1927. Rosamond Lancaster Warburton was considerably younger than Willie, who was 49 at the time. The marriage appears to have been based on genuine affection rather than the social calculation that had defined Willie's first marriage. Rosamond encouraged his museum work and participated in some yachting expeditions. She provided companionship during years when Willie was increasingly isolated from family and society. The marriage produced no children. Willie's only child was Muriel from his first marriage, and she remained distant from her father geographically and emotionally. The Vanderbilt line was fragmenting. Willie's failure to produce a male heir meant the direct lineage would end with him. The dynasty his great-grandfather had built was dissolving in the third generation. By 1935, Willie had financed racing, maintained yachts, collected specimens, and built a museum. He had achieved technical results in every domain. The Vanderbilt Cup had launched American motorsport. His expeditions had contributed real data to marine biology. His museum housed significant collections. None of it generated the recognition he sought. The achievements existed independent of him. He was the financier, not the figure. The investments had purchased everything except mattering. Chapter 7. The Fortune Fragments. The Vanderbilt fortune had fragmented by 1930. Willie's share generated approximately $2 million annually in trust income, down from $3 million a decade earlier. The trust structure that had seemed protective was revealing its trap. He could access only the income, never the principal. The income was declining. His expenses were not. Willie's grandfather had established trusts with terms designed to preserve family wealth perpetually. The principal remained legally protected, invested in railroads, bonds, and stocks. Willie received only the income those investments generated. In the 1920s, when markets were strong, that income had reached $3 million annually. The 1929 crash reduced trust principal by 30 to 40%. The income dropped accordingly. Willie could not liquidate principal to cover the shortfall. The trust terms forbade it. He was trapped with declining income and fixed expenses built on assumptions of perpetual growth. Eagle's Nest required $500,000 annually in maintenance alone, staff of 40 at its peak, groundskeeping, building maintenance, utilities, property taxes. The museum operations consumed additional funds. Yachts required constant maintenance, typically $200,000 or more yearly. Racing ventures had cost millions in capital over 2 decades. Living expenses, travel, entertaining added hundreds of thousands. Total spending had reached $1.5 to $2 million annually in good years. The expenses were sustainable only while income remained at $3 million. When income fell to $2 million by 1935, the mathematics failed. The stock market crash of October 1929 destroyed wealth across America. For the Vanderbilts, the impact was delayed but substantial. The trusts were heavily invested in railroad stocks and industrial bonds. Both sectors faced declining importance as automobiles reshaped transportation and the Depression reduced industrial activity. The trust portfolios lost value. The income those portfolios generated diminished. The structure that was supposed to protect wealth prevented Willie from adapting to changed circumstances. Railroad stocks, which had made the Vanderbilt fortune, were particularly affected. The New York Central and other railroads that had dominated late 19th century commerce faced competition from automobiles and trucks. Passenger rail was declining. Freight rail faced pressure from trucking. The investments that had seemed eternally secure in 1885 were obsolete by 1935. But Willie could not sell them. The trust controlled the assets. Willie controlled only the income. The mathematics were unforgiving. Eagle's Nest alone consumed 1/4 of Willie's annual income. The mansion required constant attention. Salt air from the Sound corroded ironwork. Winter weather damaged roofing. The elaborate tile work required specialized maintenance. Staff were needed to clean, maintain, and operate a 24-room mansion built for entertaining scores of guests, but occupied by 2 people. The scale that had seemed appropriate in 1916 had become absurd by 1935. Willie could not reduce expenses without admitting failure. Reducing Eagle's Nest staff meant acknowledging the building was too large. Closing the museum meant admitting the collections were not attracting sufficient interest. Selling yachts meant surrendering his claim to sportsman status. Each potential reduction required abandoning part of the identity he had constructed through expenditure. The psychological impossibility was as binding as the financial impossibility. Vanderbilts did not retrench visibly. Reducing one's lifestyle meant admitting that the fortune was insufficient, that the wealth was fragmenting, that the dynasty was failing. Willie could not make those admissions. His entire life had been spent trying to prove he deserved the Vanderbilt name. Reducing expenses would prove he did not. By 1937, Willie was spending more than his income could support. The fortune that had built railroads and palaces proved insufficient to maintain one man's monuments to insecurity. He could not reduce expenses without acknowledging failure. He could not increase income without liquidating protected principal. The mathematics were unforgiving. The pressure was mounting. The mansion was becoming a burden rather than a triumph. Chapter 8. The Mansion Becomes Prison. By 1938, Eagle's Nest operated with a staff of 12, down from 40 a decade earlier. The building required constant maintenance that was no longer being performed. Plaster cracked, paint peeled. The tiles, which had cost thousands to import and install, loosened from walls and floors. The ironwork rusted in the salt air. Willie walked through rooms that had once represented achievement and saw only decline. He was 60 years old, still living in the mansion he had built to prove himself, trapped by a building too expensive to maintain and too unmarketable to sell. The staff reductions began in 1935. 40 staff members became 25. By 1937, further cuts reduced the number to 15. By 1940, only 12 remained. Each reduction meant more maintenance deferred, more rooms closed, more grounds left unattended. Gardeners were dismissed first. The elaborate landscaping grew wild. Cleaning staff was cut to minimum levels. Whole wings of the mansion went undusted, unused. Kitchen staff diminished. Willie and Rosamond ate simply. Chauffeurs were let go. Willie drove himself when necessary. The visible decline in operations was impossible to hide. The building deteriorated in ways that revealed the obsessive construction that had created it. The tiles suffered moisture damage. In some sections, they fell from walls entirely. Replacement was impossible at any price Willie could afford. The originals had been custom-made in Seville. Replication would require recreating the entire commissioning process. Willie contacted Spanish tile workshops. The costs they quoted were beyond his resources. Sections of wall were left bare where tiles had fallen. The authentic Moorish patterns were incomplete. Plaster cracks spread across ceilings and walls. The original plaster had been applied by craftsmen who understood traditional Spanish techniques. Repair required similar expertise. Willie could not afford to hire specialists. He employed local workers who patched cracks with modern materials that did not match the original surface texture or color. The repairs were visible scars marking the building's decline. The ironwork corroded despite protective coatings applied during installation. Salt air from Long Island Sound was relentlessly corrosive. The hand-forged gates and railings needed regular maintenance that was no longer being performed. Rust appeared. The iron that had been brought from Madrid in 1912 was deteriorating on Long Island in 1938. Willie watched it happen without resources to prevent it. Roof leaks developed. Water damage spread through upper floors. The elaborate ceiling decorations in several rooms were stained and sagging. Repairs would require scaffolding, specialized craftsmen, and money Willie did not have. He had rooms closed off to prevent further damage. The mansion that had been built with 24 rooms was functionally reduced to perhaps a dozen usable spaces. The museum collections were deteriorating. Climate control systems, never sophisticated, broke down repeatedly. Fish specimens preserved in formaldehyde required regular monitoring and fluid replacement. The work was not being done. Some specimens were drying out. Others were degrading as the preserving fluid lost effectiveness. Willie's marine biology collection, which represented decades of expeditions and hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, was slowly being destroyed by neglect. The museum had effectively closed to any public visitors. Hours had been reduced through the mid-1930s. By 1938, the museum opened only by appointment, and appointments were rare. Scientists occasionally contacted Willie about studying specific specimens. He granted access when asked. But the vision of a public museum serving education and science had failed. The collections existed but served no purpose beyond occupying space in a building that was consuming resources without generating value. The Depression had collapsed the estate market completely. Newport mansions stood abandoned or were donated to preservation societies to avoid demolition costs. The Breakers, occupied by Cornelius Vanderbilt II's widow, was struggling financially. Marble House had become a museum to survive. Eagle's Nest was too large, too remote, too expensive to attract buyers, even if Willie had been willing to sell. Property taxes alone consumed $15,000 annually. Insurance was enormous. Basic utilities cost thousands monthly. Willie could not sell. He could not afford to maintain. He could not walk away. The fortress he had built to prove his significance was holding him prisoner. Willie's social circle had contracted to almost nothing. Visitors to Eagle's Nest were rare. He and Rosamond lived essentially alone in the mansion, built to entertain hundreds. His health was declining. Heart problems emerged in the late 1930s. The isolation amplified the building's oppressive scale. Rooms designed for crowds echoed empty. The monument to his significance had become a tomb for his final years. Other Vanderbilts contributed to various causes and maintained social prominence despite reduced fortunes. Willie had isolated himself geographically and socially. Eagle's Nest was too far from New York to maintain casual social connections. The effort required to visit discouraged even family members. Willie had built a monument to significance in a location that guaranteed obscurity. The building endured its neglect. Willie was collapsing under the weight of his mistake. Chapter 9. The Final Years. World War II transformed American consciousness in ways that made William K. Vanderbilt Jr.'s preoccupations seem impossibly distant. While Willie deteriorated at Eagle's Nest, the nation mobilized for total war. He was 62 when the war began in Europe, 63 when America entered after Pearl Harbor. His health was failing rapidly. He had 4 years remaining, which he would spend watching the world move past him in his fortress of irrelevance. The war began in Europe in September 1939. America watched nervously, preparing even before formal entry. The Gilded Age excess that had defined Willie's generation became not just outdated, but offensive. Massive private estates represented selfish consumption when the nation needed collective effort. Servants departed for war work or military service. Materials were rationed. Fuel was controlled. Maintaining Eagle's Nest became not just financially difficult, but practically impossible. Other Vanderbilts contributed to war production through industrial management. Willie had nothing to contribute. He possessed no skills relevant to warfare or industrial production. His yachts were too old and too specialized for military use. His museum served no war purpose. His expertise in Spanish Revival architecture and marine specimen collecting was completely irrelevant. The war was being won by people who could do things Willie had never learned. By 1942, Willie's health was clearly failing. Heart disease, diagnosed formally that year, had likely been developing for some time. His mobility became limited. He was increasingly confined to Eagle's Nest, not by financial inability to travel, but by physical incapacity. Rosamond cared for him as staff dwindled to fewer than 10. The museum had closed to any public visitors. The collections continued deteriorating. Willie spent his final year mostly bedridden, watching his monument decay around him. Even facing death, Willie attempted to ensure something would survive him. He tried to write a memoir. The project was abandoned after a few incomplete chapters. Willie had no stories worth telling. His life had been spent trying to accomplish things, not accomplishing them. A memoir required achievements to memorialize. He contacted scientific institutions about his marine collections. The American Museum of Natural History in New York expressed polite interest, but made no offers. The Smithsonian acknowledged the specimen's value, but noted they had their own collecting priorities. Regional institutions lacked resources during wartime to acquire and maintain large collections. Willie's decades of specimen collecting had produced material that was scientifically valuable, but institutionally unwanted. He reached out to family members about preserving Eagle's Nest. The responses were polite and non-committal. No one wanted responsibility for a massive mansion that required hundreds of thousands in annual maintenance. The Vanderbilt family fortune had fragmented. No individual member had resources to take on Willie's burden. His daughter Muriel lived in California with her own family. She had no interest in a Long Island mansion she had barely known. In his final months, Willie appears to have accepted that his life's work would not survive him in the form he had envisioned. The racing legacy would be remembered, but as institutional achievement rather than personal accomplishment. The specimens would scatter to whoever wanted them. Eagle's Nest would pass to whoever would take it. Nothing would prove that William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. had mattered beyond inheriting a famous name. William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. died on January 4, 1944, at Eagle's Nest. He was 66 years old. The cause was heart failure. Rosamond was present. Daughter Muriel was notified and arrived from California shortly after. The funeral was small and private, attended primarily by family. Few others came. The obituaries in major newspapers were brief. The New York Times noted his death in several paragraphs that focused primarily on his grandfather, the Commodore, and mentioned the Vanderbilt Cup races as his principal achievement. Eagle's Nest was barely mentioned. The museum was not mentioned at all. The estate valuation revealed the extent of financial collapse. Total assets, including depleted trust funds, were valued at approximately $5 million. Eagle's Nest itself was a liability rather than an asset, requiring immediate capital investment simply to prevent further deterioration. The museum collections had minimal market value. After debts, administrative costs, and estate taxes, little remained. Willie had not died penniless, but he had spent down his inheritance to a fraction of what he had received. Willie died having accomplished exactly what he feared. He had proven that the Vanderbilt name alone meant nothing without personal achievement to justify it. That third-generation wealth could evaporate despite desperate attempts to preserve its significance. That building monuments proved only the desperation behind their construction. Eagle's Nest stood magnificent in its deterioration. The man who built it was gone. Chapter 10. The Irony of Eagle's Nest. After William K. Vanderbilt Jr.'s death in 1944, Eagle's Nest passed through complicated negotiations involving his widow, his daughter, creditors, and Suffolk County officials. The building that Willie had constructed to demonstrate Vanderbilt prestige became, in 1950, exactly what he would have considered failure: a county park and public museum. The mansion that was supposed to prove his significance became a tourist attraction where admission cost 50 cents. The transformation was absolute. Eagle's Nest succeeded in becoming historically significant only by failing completely at its intended purpose. Rosamond had neither resources nor desire to maintain the property. She was Willie's widow, not his heir to sufficient fortune. The trust, structures that had provided Willie with income, terminated with his death. What remained was Eagle's Nest itself, the deteriorating museum, and debts that exceeded readily available assets. Rosamond could not afford to keep the property even if she wanted to. Muriel, living in California with her own family, wanted no part of the Long Island estate. While she had spent minimal time at Eagle's Nest during her childhood and had no emotional attachment to her father's monument. Her inheritance was complicated by estate taxes and creditor claims. Taking possession of Eagle's Nest would have meant assuming hundreds of thousands in deferred maintenance and ongoing operational costs. She declined. Creditors filed claims against the estate, property taxes had accumulated, contractors who had performed recent repair work were owed money. The estate lacked liquid assets to satisfy these claims immediately. Eagle's Nest represented the bulk of the estate's value, but its value was theoretical. No market existed for massive Spanish Revival mansions on Long Island in 1944. The building was unsellable at any realistic price. Suffolk County had been expanding public parkland on Long Island's North Shore. County officials were interested in acquiring waterfront properties for public access. Eagle's Nest offered 43 acres of waterfront, a historically significant building, and a marine biology collection that could serve educational purposes. The county opened negotiations with estate representatives in 1945. The discussions proceeded slowly through 4 years of legal complexities. The estate wanted to transfer the property without financial loss. The county wanted to acquire it without excessive expense. The museum collections complicated matters. Scientists needed to evaluate their condition and educational value. The building itself required inspection to determine structural soundness and estimate maintenance costs. The final agreement, reached in 1950, had Suffolk County purchase the property for $1 in exchange for assuming all maintenance obligations and agreeing to preserve the mansion and open the museum to the public. Rosamond received a small settlement from the estate's remaining liquid assets and moved away from Long Island. She died in 1959, largely forgotten. Muriel rarely visited after the county took ownership. She died in California in 1972. Neither fought to keep Willie's monument in the family. The Vanderbilt Museum opened to the public in 1950. Admission was set at 50 cents. Willie's marine biology collections were properly cataloged for the first time by professional staff. The fish specimens were scientifically valuable. Marine biology researchers visited to study them. The general public came to see the Gilded Age mansion. Tours led visitors through Eagle's Nest, explaining the Spanish Revival architecture, the imported materials, the cost and excess of construction. The building Willie had built finally attracted the attention he had craved. But the narrative presented was not the one he had intended. The guided tours focused on Gilded Age excess and the eventual failure of inherited wealth. Willie's story became a cautionary tale rather than a celebration. The building was appreciated as an artifact of a lost era, not as an achievement of its builder. Visitors marveled at the expense and craftsmanship while absorbing lessons about the futility of building monuments to insecurity. The mansion succeeded where Willie had failed, but succeeded by demonstrating his failure. The irony extended to every aspect of the property's transformation. Willie had wanted Eagle's Nest to prove his personal significance. It became a public park that erased his personal story. He had wanted the museum to demonstrate his scientific contribution. It became an educational resource that credited his employees' work rather than his patronage. He had wanted the building to establish the Vanderbilt name as culturally important. It became evidence that the Vanderbilt fortune had fragmented and failed in the third generation. The Vanderbilt Cup races developed a legacy independent of Willie's personal story. Motorsport historians recognize the races as foundational to American automobile competition. The series had influenced the development of the Indianapolis 500 and had forced European manufacturers to take American racing seriously. Willie's name remained attached to the events. Vanderbilt Cup became shorthand for early American motorsport, but the name referred to the institution, not the individual. Modern racing organizations acknowledged the debt to Willie's vision and financing. In 2014, A new series revived the Vanderbilt Cup name, though organized by different groups with no connection to the family. Willie's contribution was recognized in abstract terms. Founded by William K. Vanderbilt, Jr., appeared in historical summaries. The personal story behind that founding, the desperate search for significance, the attempt to build reputation through expenditure, was absent from these accounts. The achievement had separated completely from the achiever. Suffolk County invested substantially in Eagle's Nest's preservation over the decades following acquisition. Major restorations in the 1960s and 1970s stabilized the structure and conserved the original materials. The tiles were properly maintained using techniques Willie had never employed. The ironwork received professional conservation treatment. The building achieved the permanence Willie had wanted, but through public investment rather than private wealth. The costs of proper maintenance exceeded what Willie had spent annually, but spread across taxpayers and supplemented by admission fees and grants, the expenses became manageable. The building he could not afford to maintain privately was successfully maintained collectively. The lesson was unmistakable. Willie's personal resources had been insufficient for his personal monument, but public resources could preserve what had become a public asset. Today, the Vanderbilt Museum attracts more than 100,000 visitors annually. Educational programs serve local schools. The Spanish Revival architecture is appreciated by architectural historians. Willie's fish collections remain displayed and studied. A planetarium was added to the complex decades after Willie's death, an addition he never envisioned. The building serves the public education and cultural enrichment Willie had nominally intended but never effectively delivered. Eagle's Nest succeeded by becoming the opposite of what Willie wanted, a democratic institution rather than a monument to individual achievement. Eagle's Nest achieved everything William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. wanted, except the essential element. It brought him no credit. The building proved architecturally significant. It attracted visitors and admiration. It outlasted its era and remained culturally relevant. Willie received none of the recognition. The mansion succeeded by demonstrating the builder's failure. The irony was as brutal as the economics that had trapped him. His greatest achievement was the structure he created to prove himself, but the structure proved nothing about him, except that wealth without vision produces monuments that outlive and outlast the desperate purposes behind their construction. Chapter 11. The Pattern Analysis. The Vanderbilt fortune that totaled $200 million in 1885 had diminished to approximately $1.5 million by 1970, when one of the last direct male descendants died. The dissolution took 3 generations and followed a pattern repeated across dozens of Gilded Age families. The Astors, the Belmonts, the Whitneys all watched fortunes fragment and evaporate despite trust structures designed to preserve wealth perpetually. Willie's failure was not exceptional. It was typical. The second and third generations of American industrial dynasties faced systematic problems that individual talent or effort could not overcome. The pattern was remarkably consistent across families. The first generation built the fortune through talent, ruthlessness, or fortunate positioning in expanding industries. The Commodore built his fortune in steamships and railroads. His generation created the wealth. The second generation typically managed competently. William Henry doubled the Vanderbilt fortune through shrewd railroad consolidation. Willie's father, William K. Sr., served ably as railroad director and investor. The second generation was competent but rarely brilliant. They maintained what they inherited without adding substantially to it. The third generation faced structural impossibility. They inherited wealth but not the conditions that created it. Industries matured, competition increased, economic returns normalized. The fortunes that seemed infinite when built proved finite when merely maintained. Willie's generation had wealth but no purpose, resources but no mission, names but no achievements to justify them. Vincent Astor, inheritor of part of the Astor real estate fortune, died in 1959 with his inheritance greatly diminished. The Belmont family followed similar patterns of fragmentation. The Whitney fortune survived better than most but still fragmented across generations. Each family's details differed. The pattern remained constant. The second generation often proved capable stewards. The third generation, lacking the purpose that had driven wealth creation, attempted to build significance through expenditure rather than achievement. They built mansions, financed cultural institutions, patronized the arts, all attempting to prove they deserved their inheritances. Most failed to achieve the recognition they sought. The economic ground shifted beneath inherited fortunes between 1920 and 1950. The 1929 crash devastated trust portfolios, heavily invested in railroads and industrial bonds. Both sectors faced declining importance as automobiles and aviation reshaped transportation. New wealth emerged from oil, automobiles, and aviation. Old wealth remained trapped in obsolete investments through trust structures designed for stability. Tax policy transformed as well. The Gilded Age had featured minimal estate and income taxes. New Deal policies introduced progressive taxation that made maintaining large fortunes increasingly difficult. Trust income faced higher tax rates. Estate taxes claimed substantial portions when wealth transferred between generations. The systematic environment that had allowed fortune accumulation reversed into an environment that encouraged dispersion. The trust structure itself became a trap. Designed to protect principal and ensure perpetual income, trusts worked well in expanding economies with stable investment returns. They failed catastrophically when economic conditions changed. Willie could not sell railroad stocks that were declining in value because he did not control the principal. He could only watch as the income those stocks generated diminished year by year. The trustees who managed these trusts were typically lawyers and bankers who prioritized preservation over growth. They invested conservatively in established industries and blue-chip securities. When those industries became obsolete and those securities lost value, the trustees had limited ability to adapt. Trust documents written in the 1880s did not anticipate the economic transformations of the 1930s and 1940s. The legal structures locked wealth into investments that were failing. Willie's failure was overdetermined by systematic forces. The trust structure limited his options, while declining income reduced his resources. Economic transformation made his investments obsolete. Tax policies encouraged wealth dispersion. Social changes made Gilded Age lifestyles increasingly indefensible. Generational patterns made his purposelessness predictable. He was born into a system designed to preserve wealth under conditions that were rapidly disappearing. The Vanderbilt fortune was not lost primarily through Willie's personal failures. It was lost through systematic problems affecting an entire class. Willie simply demonstrated the pattern most clearly through his desperate, expensive, futile attempts to prove he mattered despite it all. Chapter 12. Legacy and Lessons. The Vanderbilt Museum on Long Island attracts more than 100,000 visitors annually. They tour Eagle's Nest, admire the architecture Willie commissioned, photograph the craftsmanship he purchased, and walk through rooms that consumed enormous resources to create. The guided tours mention William K. Vanderbilt Jr. as the builder, reference his racing legacy, note his collecting efforts. They do not dwell on the fact that he died with his fortune depleted in the mansion they are touring. They do not emphasize that the building succeeded only by becoming exactly what Willie feared, evidence that money cannot purchase significance. Modern tours last approximately 90 minutes. Guides focus on Spanish Revival architectural features, explaining the style's characteristics and Eagle's Nest's examples. The tile work receives attention as genuinely impressive craftsmanship. The ironwork is noted for its traditional techniques. Willie's story receives perhaps 5 minutes of a 90-minute tour. The narrative presented is carefully curated, built by William K. Vanderbilt Jr., grandson of the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, founded the Vanderbilt Cup automobile races, collected marine specimens during Pacific expeditions, opened this museum in the 1920s. The financial collapse receives brief, euphemistic acknowledgement. After his death, the property passed to Suffolk County. Visitors leave with impression of a successful Vanderbilt who built an impressive mansion and contributed to science and sport. The reality that Willie spent his life desperately attempting to prove significance and died having failed is carefully omitted. The museum's institutional interests require presenting a positive narrative. The tragedy is smoothed into achievement. The building's success depends partly on forgetting the builder's failure. Eagle's Nest proves that architectural achievement is independent of builder's intent. The mansion is genuinely significant as Spanish Revival architecture. The materials were finest available. The craftsmanship was expert. The preservation has been excellent. These qualities exist regardless of Willie's motivations or outcomes. But the building proves nothing about Willie himself. Its architectural merit does not confer merit on its creator. The structure's survival does not validate the life spent building it. Quality of construction does not equal significance of person. This disconnect between what Willie built and what it meant about him was the fundamental miscalculation he never corrected. He believed buildings could confer significance. They cannot. They can only preserve themselves. Tech billionaires and finance titans build museums, concert halls, and universities, attempting to ensure their names survive their lifetimes. Some efforts represent genuine philanthropy, with community benefit as primary motivation. Others reveal the same desperate proof-seeking that drove Willie. The pattern repeats across generations with different details. Ultra-wealthy individuals feeling insignificant despite wealth build physical monuments to demonstrate worth. The outcomes vary. Carnegie Hall succeeded because Andrew Carnegie built for the community's benefit, not his own validation. Eagle's Nest failed because Willie built to prove himself rather than serve others. The fundamental difference lies in intent and purpose. Buildings created to serve communities sometimes achieve lasting significance. Monuments to personal insecurity rarely outlast the insecurity that created them. Willie's error was assuming that expensive construction equaled cultural contribution. Modern versions of this error, vanity museums, ego-driven cultural centers, monuments disguised as philanthropy, suggest the lesson remains unlearned. Wealth cannot purchase significance. Building monuments to prove worth proves only the desperation behind the attempt. Second and third generation heirs face structural problems beyond individual solution. Trust structures simultaneously protect and trap. Fortunes that seemed infinite prove finite across generations. The difference between Willie's Vanderbilt Cup and his Eagle's Nest reveals the distinction between achievement and expenditure. The Cup succeeded because it served the emerging motorsport community. The mansion failed because it served only Willie's need for validation. Intent matters more than investment. Purpose determines outcome more than expense. Willie's fundamental error was believing buildings could confer the significance their builders seek. They cannot. Significance must be earned through achievement, created, through contribution, built through service. It cannot be purchased, constructed, or commissioned. Eagle's Nest stands as monument to this truth. Wealth can create magnificent structures, but cannot make their creators matter. Willie spent his inheritance and lifetime attempting to justify the Vanderbilt name he carried. He succeeded only in demonstrating that inherited wealth without earned achievement produces buildings that outlast their builders while proving nothing about them. Eagle's Nest serves purposes Willie never intended. The architecture endures. The builder is largely forgotten. The monument survived its creator while teaching lessons Willie never meant to impart. Standing at Eagle's Nest today, the mansion looks much as it did when construction finished in 1916. The tiles still cover walls and floors, their geometric patterns as precise as when craftsmen installed them a century ago. The ironwork still frames windows and balconies, dark against Long Island sky. Stone walls still stand fortress thick, built to endure centuries. The building has survived. Willie has not. His name appears on historical markers. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Jr., 1878-1944, builder of Eagle's Nest, founder of the Vanderbilt Cup races. The facts are recorded. The man is absent. The dates mark existence but not significance. The museum opens daily. Tours run on schedule. Visitors photograph the architecture and leave impressed by the craftsmanship. They learn about Spanish Revival style and Gilded Age excess. They hear that Willie collected marine specimens and organized automobile races. They do not learn that he died trapped in the building they are touring, his fortune depleted, his purpose unfulfilled, his desperate attempts to matter having failed completely. The building accomplished everything Willie wanted except the essential element. It achieved architectural significance. It attracted attention and visitors. It outlasted its era and remained culturally relevant across generations. It proved permanent and impressive and worthy of preservation. It proved nothing about Willie except what he most feared. That being a Vanderbilt heir meant nothing if the heir himself achieved nothing. That money could build monuments, but not meaning. That third-generation wealth could fragment despite desperate attempts to preserve its significance through construction. Willie built a monument that would prove he mattered. The monument stands. Willie does not. The building succeeded. The builder failed. This is what enormous wealth purchased, proof that money cannot buy the one thing Willie needed, not significance, just the illusion he had achieved it. The mansion endures. The man does not.